Hey kids, this is an introduction to The Guillotine at Work, Volume 1 by Grigorii Petrovich Maksimov, who lived from 1893 to 1950. According to Wikipedia, Grigorii Petrovich Maksimov, again, 1893 to 1950, was a Russian anarcho-syndicalist. From the first days of the Russian Revolution, Grigorii Petrovich Maksimov played a leading role in the country's syndicalist movement, editing the newspaper Golos Truda and organizing the formation of factory committees. Following the October Revolution, Grigorii Petrovich Maksimov came into conflict with the Bolsheviks, who he fiercely criticized for their authoritarian and centralist tendencies. For his anti-Bolshevik activities, Grigorii Petrovich Maksimov was eventually arrested and imprisoned before finally being deported from the country. In exile, Grigorii Petrovich Maksimov continued to lead the anarcho-syndicalist movement, spearheading the establishment of the International Workers' Association, of which he was a member until his death. And the International Workers' Association is an international federation of anarcho-syndicalist labor unions. It aims to create unions capable of fighting for the economic and political interests of the working class and eventually to directly abolish capitalism and the state through, quote, the establishment of economic communities and administrative organs run by the workers. At its peak, the International represented millions of people worldwide. Its member unions played a central role in the social conflicts of the 1920s and 1930s. However, the International was formed as many countries were entering periods of extreme repression, and many of the largest IWA unions were shattered during that period. Okay, so here we go. Can't find anything for Bill Nowlin. But here's his introduction. The Guillotine at Work offers us two very important lessons. First of all, Maximoff describes the terror under Lenin. His book stands as one of the most comprehensive documentations of the terror of the early Soviet state, which began under Lenin and was not just a Stalinist development. The principal lesson Maximov wishes to communicate, though, was that Marxism-Leninism was a theory which, despite its revolutionary style, was in essence counter-revolutionary. This line of argument is a difficult one for many people to accept. While all but the most dogmatic Stalinists recognize and recoil at the brutality of the Stalin era, it is believed almost equally widely that this was due to a political deformation characteristic of Stalin the man and not an endemic feature of Marxism-Leninism itself. Lenin is permitted to retain an aura of sacrosanctity. Whoever might broadly condemn Marxism-Leninism rather than focus their critique on the Stalin personality cult is immediately suspect as an unregenerate reactionary. To avoid this charge, Maximov has confined the material he presents to that which emanates from socialist, anarchist, and official Bolshevik sources. The idea that the Great Russian Revolution was ultimately perverted and channeled into an authoritarian and repressive regime is not a new idea. Most feel this occurred after Lenin's death. Even as honest and sincere work as Roy Medvedev's Let History Judge, a masterful and devastating dissection of Stalinist Russia, lets Lenin off scot-free. Wikipedia says Let History Judge is a Soviet history book by Roy Medvedev that critiques Stalinism from a Marxist perspective. Let History Judge's publication in 1969 resulted in Medvedev's expulsion from the Communist Party and in subsequent harassment. Roy Medvedev said of his methodology that, quote, I did not make use or have access to any closed archives, quote, special collections, end quote, or any other limited access depositories, and I am not familiar with any, end quote. End quote. There could not be a published source for much of the information in this book. It was passed on by the victims of repression or their friends or relatives, end quote. The book was republished in expanded form in 1989. And according to Columbia University Press page, it says, the most comprehensive and revealing investigation of Stalinism and political developments in the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1953, this edition is an extensively revised and expanded version of a classic work. The internationally known historian Roy Medvedev has included more than 100 new interviews, unpublished memoirs, and archives from survivors of Stalin's death camps. This updated version of a classic work was written during a time of great change in the Soviet Union. With the advent of perestroika and glasnost, more progressive leadership has sought to demolish the Stalinist system, which had finally crippled the Soviet Union and incited public discontent. Let History Judge contains new material on purges in 1929 to 1931 and terror against the peasantry, the Kirov assassination and show trials, the quote, Great Terror, from 1936 to 1938, which caused irreparable damage to the Soviet Union and left the Soviet Union vulnerable for Hitler's attack in 1941, the trial of Bukharin, Trotsky's revolutionary activity, and Stalin's involvement with his murder in Mexico, Stalin's miscalculations and errors during the war, which cost the Soviet Union nearly 25 million in casualties, new purges from 1946 to 1953, and the actual vote of the 17th Congress, which decided Stalin's candidacy. Since the first edition was published by the author in 1969 and published in 1971, dozens of new informants have come forward to give their evidence to Roy Medvedev. Distinguished Soviet literary, cultural, and political figures like the late Alexander Tvardovsky, Ilya Ehrenberg, Konstantin Simonov, Yuri Trifonov, and Mikhail Rohm, and many others have accumulated documentary records of Stalinism in anticipation of an expanded version. And it says Roy Medvedev is a prominent and highly respected Soviet historian of international reputation. His books include On Soviet Descent and the October Revolution, published by Columbia University Press. Roy Medvedev has had articles published in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and Dissent. Back to the text. It is only, to quote, the typical bourgeois historian, end quote, suggests Medvedev that, quote, Stalin's activity is seen as the logical continuation of Lenin's, end quote. Medvedev is legitimately fearful that a wholesale rejection of proletarian socialism might result from attributing to Marxism and Leninism itself the origins of the terror and crimes of the Stalin era. However, there do exist other forms of proletarian socialism than Marxism and Leninism, and the dedicated revolutionary must hold each and every one up to the most penetrating criticism. Clarity of understanding is essential to the development of authentic revolutionary consciousness. If we are to learn from the mistakes of the past, we cannot exempt any tendency or revolutionary figure from dispassionate consideration of their contributions and their shortcomings. Lenin, according to Maximoff, quote, followed in the footsteps of the French Jacobins, end quote. Lenin believed in the necessity and even desirability of terror to implement his program in himself and the legitimacy of his authority. Maximoff presents scores of quotations from Lenin's published works in which Lenin urged shootings of political opponents, urged against sentimentality in the waging of political struggle, and urged his fellow Bolsheviks to adopt unashamedly a policy of red terror. Maximoff charges that Lenin deliberately chose to provoke civil war in the countryside, to terrorize the peasantry and force their compliance with the forced grain requisitions, to subject them to state regimentation, quote, that we brought civil war to the village is something that we hold up as a merit, end quote, wrote Lenin. The use of the death penalty was very rare in Tsarist Russia. When the Bolsheviks came to power, one of the first things they did in Lenin's absence was to abolish the death penalty. Lenin reacted furiously, quote, beside himself with indignation, end quote, in Trotsky's description, quote, how, end quote, Lenin demanded to know, quote, can a revolution be made without executions, end quote. Maximoff compiles from official Bolshevik sources statistical summaries of the number of executions in each year of Lenin's rule. Estimates based on these figures range from 200,000 to over 1,500,000 shootings during Lenin's period of leadership. Maximoff is willing to settle for the most conservative of all figures. There is no question but that the Russian Revolution was a bloody affair. It would be unfair for anyone to attribute all of the deaths to Lenin's policies. Over 10 million to 12 million lives. Any revolution takes lives. The White Guardist counter-revolutionaries were certainly responsible for many deaths. The point is that many, if not most, of these millions of lives were shed not just because of the inevitable cost of revolutionary struggle, but because Lenin insisted on implementing his own view of how that struggle should develop. Rather than allow the people themselves to establish autonomous and federated revolutionary regimes in the various eras of the Tsarist Empire, in the Ukraine, in Georgia, in Siberia, and so forth, Lenin insisted that a single regime should rule over all nationalities. This despite the fact that Lenin had earlier promised full freedom of all nationalities. The Tsarist Empire was kept intact with a single party asserting its political dominance, at tremendous cost. The crushing of the revolutionary peasants of the Ukraine is the best known example. By the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Lenin ceded the Ukraine to Germany as part of his deal to gain peace. The Ukrainian people, though, organized spontaneously to resist German occupation, and they were successful. They drove the Germans out of the Ukraine. They also fought off counter-revolutionary forces who tried to take over the Ukraine. Rather than allow the heroic peoples of this region to govern themselves and regulate their own lives, Lenin and Trotsky sent in the Red Army to crush the independent revolutionary movement of the Ukraine. Nestor Makhno is remembered today as one of the more courageous leaders in the fight against the Germans and counter-revolutionaries, and, of tragic necessity, against the Bolshevik invasion as well. Makhno was but one of many, and the Ukraine is simply the best known of many regions which fell under the rule of Moscow and Lenin. Lenin insisted on the supremacy of his own revolutionary program. Revolutionists of any other persuasion were forced out of their position, jailed, exiled, and executed. Lenin had been in Zurich when the revolution broke out, Trotsky in New York. The Bolsheviks were a minority party with little real following, even among the workers. The other revolutionary groups represented a threat to Lenin's domination. The left socialist revolutionaries had the support of by far the overwhelming mass of the peasantry. The anarchists had the most popular slogans. Lenin moved swiftly to crush both. As mentioned above, most of Maximoff's data covers the Leninist terror as directed against socialists and revolutionaries of non-Bolshevik persuasions. Here the most prominent instance was the assault against the revolutionary people of Kronstadt. The sailors of Kronstadt had an unblemished record as being at the forefront of any revolutionary struggle. When they called for the Bolsheviks to respect the rights of sincere revolutionists to speak and to publish, and to permit the organization of free Soviets, the response was a military assault in which thousands, up to 18,000 of the most dedicated revolutionists in all of Russia, were slaughtered because they dared to challenge the uniformity of Bolshevik rule. This despite the fact that the Supreme Military Council of the Bolshevik regime itself admitted, in a secret internal document which Maximoff presents, that, quote, the political department of the Baltic Fleet found itself isolated, not only from the masses but also from local party workers, having become a bureaucratic organ lacking any prestige and standing, destroyed all local initiative and brought the work down to the level of clerical routine, from July to November 1920, 20% of the members left the party, end quote. Admitting that they had failed here, the Bolshevik leaders were afraid their supremacy would be challenged. Already strikes were spreading in Petrograd itself, so they told their troops that these were being engineered by counter-revolutionary White Guardists in Kronstadt and sent them in to eliminate those who might show up the Bolsheviks from a revolutionary point of view. The Guillotine at Work documents dozens of other instances in which the Bolsheviks imprisoned and executed authentic revolutionaries who, they feared, might threaten their exclusive control. Myasnikov, a worker and leader of the Bolshevik organization of Motovilika, protested against the suppression of free discussion even within the Bolshevik party itself. quote, "Those who fear to let the working class and peasantry speak out always fear counter-revolution and see it everywhere," end quote, wrote Myasnikov in a pamphlet for internal party use only. I think Myasnikov was one of the only Bolsheviks to oppose the repression of Kronstadt as well. A man who spent 7.5 of his 11 years of party membership in Tsarist prisons, a worker who escaped from exile not to flee abroad but for party work in Russia, Myasnikov complained that it was primarily peasants and workers who were being arrested on charges of counter-revolution because they disagree with the strict interpretation of the Bolshevik line. Quote, "Don't you know that thousands of proletarians are kept in prison because they talked the way I am talking now? That bourgeois people are not arrested on this score for the simple reason that they are never concerned with these questions," end quote. Myasnikov was expelled from the party, imprisoned, and then sent into exile. He eventually returned to the Soviet Union for some reason in the late 1930s and is presumed to have been executed. When Lenin felt forced by events to retreat a few steps with his new economic policy, he could not simply admit that other revolutionists had been correct on this one point. In fact, Lenin reversed himself, against the bitter opposition of many members of his party. That admission would weaken the exclusivity of Bolshevik leadership, the one thing that was never to be questioned. Accordingly, Lenin developed a rationale for shooting these potential opponents. Of, quote, "the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries who advocated such views," end quote, Lenin wrote that they, quote, "wonder when we tell them that we are going to shoot them for saying such things. They are amazed at it, but the question is clear. When an army is in retreat, it stands in need of discipline 100 times more severe than when that army advances, because in the latter case everyone is eager to rush ahead. But if now everyone is just as eager to rush back, the result will be catastrophe. And when a Menshevik says, quote, 'You are now retreating, but I was always favoring a retreat,' I am in full accord with you. I am one of your people, let us retreat together," end quote. We tell them in reply, an avowal of Menshevik views should be punished by our revolutionary courts with shooting, otherwise the latter are not courts, but God knows what, end quote. Lenin. Lenin's desire was to see the revolution through, but only in the way Lenin thought correct. Let us grant that Lenin was sincere. We still have to question Lenin's self-assured single-mindedness, which brooked no opposition and permitted no other approach. Looking at some of the attributes of his program today makes one think twice about how revolutionary Lenin really was. Maximoff had no doubt on that score. Maximoff saw Lenin as a, quote, "representative of a degenerating party," end quote. Not Gavril Myasnikov, Maximoff. We're talking about here. Maximoff had no doubt on that score. Maximoff saw Lenin as, quote, "a representative of a degenerating gentry," end quote, and even went so far as to call Lenin, quote, "the first theoretician of fascism," end quote. While this extreme language probably tends to alienate the unconvinced rather than to provoke thought, a good case can be made that Leninist policies were essentially counter-revolutionary, that the net impact of Lenin's rule was to frustrate and stall out the authentic revolutionary momentum of the Russian people. It is an argument I have developed somewhat more fully elsewhere. See my introduction to Alexander Berkman's The Russian Tragedy, also published by Cienfuegos Press and Christie Books Kindle editions. Berkman's writings, Emma Goldman's works on Russia, Maximov's The Guillotine at Work, and Maurice Brinton's The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, 1917 to 1921, The State and Counter-Revolution, are among the books which led me to focus on this theme, one which I feel is vital to our time, which at first glance permit us the alternative only of international cartel capitalism and Marxist-Leninist authoritarian bureaucratic rule. Lenin did not stress socialism per se. Lenin pushed for nationalization, state ownership, and control of the means of production, where the workers and peasants had taken over the land and factories for themselves and begun to institute true socialism. Lenin took a step backwards by asserting state supremacy. Much of the struggle in the Civil War was due to Lenin's efforts to subordinate the spontaneously created autonomous workers' councils, trade unions, and peasant organizations. Maximoff quotes Lenin, quote, "We leave to ourselves the state power, only to ourselves, ... It is necessary that everything should be subjected to the Soviet power, and all the illusions about some kind of, quote, independence, end quote, on the part of detached layers of population or workers' cooperatives should be lived down as soon as possible, ... There can be no question of independence on the part of separate groups, ... End quote." Lenin. Lenin made a principle of reinstituting one-man management rather than the new collective management that the workers and peasants had developed in the interest of responsibility to state supervision. He reinstituted higher pay and privileges for specialists and managers, as against the equality of pay in the industrial democracy which the workers themselves had promulgated. Lenin also reintroduced piecework, the tailor system, more precisely the elements thereof, and others of the most hated elements of capitalism. Check out the pieces, especially for the Lenin and Taylor by Rainer Traub on this channel. Because, to his way of thinking, the party represented the real interests of the workers, and it was also acceptable to outlaw strikes. Only counter-revolutionaries, Lenin believed, would ever want to strike against a workers' state. Capitalism was, to both Lenin and Marx, an inevitable stage of historical evolution. It was not possible to move from a fundamentally feudal system to a socialism of abundance without an intervening period of capital accumulation and centralization. It's important to note Marx's conception of socialist revolutionary possibilities in Russia being steeped in the countryside on the basis of the Mir, or the Obstchina, and not on the industrial proletariat as in the case of Western Europe. Marx thought there was a way for a combination of the collective elements in the countryside of Russia to politically align themselves with the revolutionary working class of Western Europe and develop socialism on that basis, but not as viewing Russia as necessarily having to go through capitalism. Anyway, Lenin's understanding of history and economic development convinced Lenin that a transitional stage of state capitalism, he did allow that a period of private capitalism could be omitted, was a historical necessity. I was actually listening to another piece on this channel by Andreas Wilt today called Totalitarian State Capitalism, which argues precisely this. Lenin recommended we, quote, learn about state capitalism from the Germans, to assimilate the Germans' methods, not to spare any dictatorial methods in order to accelerate the westernization of barbarous Russia, not to recoil from using barbarous methods of struggle against barbarism, ... govern with greater firmness than the capitalists did. Otherwise, you will not win. You must remember, your administration must be more stringent and firm than the old administration, ... This discipline included harsh, stringent measures, going as far as shootings, methods which even the old government did not visualize, end quote. Lenin. It's not surprising that revolutionary workers revolted against Lenin's program, which appeared to combine many of the worst abuses of capitalism with a, quote, iron discipline, end quote, only justifying the regime to which the workers had to bend by proclaiming that it was issuing these orders and decrees in the name of the workers as a government of workers. Lenin's program of replacing factory management by the workers themselves with party committee management and the subversion of the trade unions robbed the workers of most of the gains the workers felt they had earned through struggle. The peasants felt no less betrayed. Maximoff angrily assigns to Lenin's account the millions of deaths caused by the famines which his policies of terror entailed. Quote, by his policy of terror, by the destruction of the peasant economy, by exiling thousands of peasants from their native place, by the policy of grain requisitions, etc., Lenin prepared one of the ghastliest famines in the history of Russia, the famine of 1921, which carried away millions of lives and crippled, physically and morally, tens of millions, end quote. Maximov. At least in the end of the Civil War, a lot of the hunger, to my understanding, was due to transportation, destruction of transportation. venues. Obviously, the starvation of the peasantry also, who are directly accessed to land, definitely, you couldn't say it had nothing to do with grain requisitioning of the period of war communism. That would be untrue. Maximoff, following in the footsteps of Bakunin, traces the Leninist policy to, quote, political Marxism, end quote, itself. Russian socialism had always been, quote, distinguished by its libertarian and progressive character, end quote, writes Maximoff in opening his book. Quote, political Marxism, end quote, though, quote, is an anachronism, a vestige of the dying past, and is altogether reactionary in its essence. The Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels is a reactionary manifesto and is in striking contradiction to science, to progress in general, and humanism in particular. The demands of dictatorship, of absolute centralization, of political and economic life in the hands of the state, of, quote, forming industrial armies, especially for agriculture, end quote, of a regimented agriculture in accordance with a single plan, a raising of the state to the position of an absolute, and the resulting stultification of the individual, its rights and interests. All that is nothing but the program of reaction, which is incompatible with human progress, with freedom, equality, and humanism. The realization of these demands carries with it state slavery, end quote. Maximoff. 1 second. Lenin was only able to introduce, quote, political Marxism, end quote, onto the Russian scene by proclaiming other ideas, quote, if he had come out in 1917 with the ideas of the Communist Manifesto, end quote, Maximoff argues, quote, he would never have attained success, and like Tkachev, the Jacobin, Lenin would have remained a rather inconspicuous figure throughout the revolution, end quote. According to Wikipedia, Pieter Nikitich Tkachev lived from 1844 to 1886, was a Russian writer, critic, and revolutionary theorist who formulated many of the revolutionary principles that were later developed and put into action by Vladimir Lenin. Although Tkachev is sometimes described as the, quote, first Bolshevik, end quote, Tkachev did not figure prominently in the mythology of the Soviet Union. Back to the text. Lenin adopted the anarchist slogans in 1917 for tactical purposes, proclaiming the libertarian positions that were clearly the most popular among the Russian masses. Lenin was a brilliant politician, and Lenin pulled off his total about-face when it was necessary to do so, even though it meant turning his back on virtually everything Lenin's party had stood for. Indeed, the other Bolshevik leaders thought Lenin had lost his head. The deception worked, though. It was, in some cases, a number of years before it hit home with other revolutionists that Lenin had never meant the things he wrote in, for instance, The State and Revolution, which had convinced many that he was honestly in support of the movements of the people. In fact, though, Lenin had not changed any other than temporary and tactical considerations. Maximoff makes abundantly clear that Lenin never intended to change, and that Lenin employed Machiavellian political tactics to consolidate himself and his party in power. Once established in power, Lenin moved firmly and unhesitatingly against the only real threat that was likely, a threat from the left. Lenin needed not have feared such a threat had he not so doggedly and dogmatically held that his own programs should be applied. In time, political opposition certainly would have manifested itself, but had Lenin been willing to work with other tendencies, this opposition could have been comradely. Instead, as Masnikov's insight indicates, Lenin feared the airing of views other than his own. Lenin was a most dynamic figure, and the Bolsheviks had won the support of many veteran anarchists who had long opposed what Lenin had always stood for. Coming from a tradition that posed itself against Marx himself, one can read with sympathy the tragic hopes of a prominent anarchist, such as Alexander Berkman, who tried as long as he could to maintain revolutionary solidarity with the Bolsheviks. After all, it was a time of crisis, a world war, economic disruption in the extreme, counter-revolutionary invasions and plots, capitalist hostility. And this is the thing, this is very important for me. just because people talk about, Rosa Luxemburg's critical support or support of the Bolsheviks. And she died in January 1919. And I think that, and it's important to note, is that in 1919, the world anarchist movement, to my understanding, more or less, for the most part at least, especially the social anarchists, were very, very enthusiastic about the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks. So that's always an important thing that I kind of always harp on. It was not a simple matter of toleration. After all, the left SRs assassinated Mirbach. Wikipedia says the Left SR uprising or Left SR revolt was a rebellion against the Bolsheviks by the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party in Moscow, Soviet Russia, on the 6th to 7th July 1918. The Left SR revolt was one of a number of left-wing uprisings against the Bolsheviks which took place during the Russian Civil War. The Left SRs entered the Bolshevik government of Soviet Russia after the October Revolution of 1917, but resigned from the Council of People's Commissars in March 1918 in protest of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Left SRs continued to work in other organizations, notably the Cheka, while denouncing the treaty and policy of requisitioning grain from the peasants. After winning only a minority of seats in the 5th All-Russian Congress of Soviets on the 6th of July, the Left SRs assassinated Wilhelm von Mirbach, the German ambassador in Moscow, in hope of recommencing the war against, quote, German imperialism, end quote, and of igniting a popular uprising. The rebels occupied the Cheka headquarters and took its leader, Felix Dzerzhinsky, hostage, seized the telephone exchange and telegraph office, and issued manifestos. Mikhail Muravyev, a Left SR and Red Army commander in the east, seized Zimbirsk. After the uprising was suppressed with the help from the Latvian riflemen, the Bolsheviks arrested most of the party's leaders and expelled all of its members from the Soviets. Wikipedia says Wilhelm von Mirbach lived from 1871 to 1918 and was a German diplomat. Wilhelm von Mirbach was assassinated while ambassador to Moscow. Back to the text. The German ambassador. Dora Kaplan shot and wounded Lenin. According to Wikipedia, Fanny Efimovna Kaplan lived from 1890 to 1918 and was a Russian socialist revolutionary who attempted to assassinate Vladimir Lenin. Fanny Kaplan was arrested and executed by the Cheka in 1918. Born into a Jewish family, Kaplan served a sentence of hard labor during the Tsarist years for her revolutionary activities. As a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, Kaplan viewed Lenin as a, quote, traitor to the revolution, end quote, when the Bolsheviks enacted one-party rule and banned her party. On the 30th of August 1918, Kaplan approached Lenin, who was leaving a Moscow factory, and fired 3 shots which badly injured him. Interrogated by the Cheka, Kaplan refused to name any accomplices and was executed. The Kaplan attempt and the Mosai-Uritsky assassination were used by the government of Soviet Russia for the reinstatement of capital punishment, which had been abolished by the Russian Provisional Government in March 1917. Back to the text. A group said to include members of the underground anarchists and the left SRs exploded a bomb during a meeting at the Moscow Committee of the Communist Party. These and similar acts across the country reflect determined efforts by the revolutionary opposition to challenge the direction of Bolshevik policy. Lenin seemed constitutionally unable to tolerate opposition. However, and one suspects these incidents did not so much provoke the terroristic suppression of the revolutionary opposition as provide helpful excuses for its implementation. Well before the revolution itself, Lenin's intolerance is easily demonstrated. He had a driving need to see his views prevail. Lenin was absolutely unshakably certain of their correctness, and yet, at the same time, he seemed to fear an open airing of other views. Maximoff presents us here with a great deal of material for thought. The original work, over 600 pages long, also included a second section documenting extensively the persecution of the anarchists under Lenin's regime. Although copies of the original are rather rare, it was issued in 1940 not by a commercial publishing house, but by the Chicago section of the Alexander Berkman Fund. It was decided to omit this section for this edition. Maximoff's message is contained in the first half of the book, which is here reissued in an unabridged form. The second section of the book was in the nature of an appendix, a documentation that focused on the particular case of the anarchists as victims. The reader interested to explore further can now find a reasonably good selection of works offering an alternative view of the Russian Revolution, a view different from the standard view in which both the capitalists and the communists concur. We hope the republication of the Guillotine at Work can inspire new and creative thought guided by a better understanding of the lessons of the past. I'm looking at the I'm seeing if these footnotes have anything to say. Maximov also wrote of Lenin, quote, "Since Lenin was, like Marx and Engels, a Jacobin, he thought in terms and images of the latter. He could not conceive a revolution without terror, and he held that the French Revolution became great only because of terror, and that the Russian Revolution can be great and successful only if it pursues a terroristic policy." End quote. Footnote 5 says, "The Anarchism of Nestor Makhno by Michael Pali." For the most scholarly work on the subject, important primary sources include Arshinov's History of the Makhnovist Movement and Volin's The Unknown Revolution. My own summary of the literature is the Makhnovist Movement in Black Rose 2 may be of interest to some. As late as August 1917, even John Reed was characterizing the Bolsheviks as a, quote, "small sect," end quote. See Leonard Shapiro, Origin of the Communist Party, of the Communist Autocracy, and J. Sorensen, The Life and Death of Soviet Trade Unionism. On page 9, Sorensen writes, quote, "Bolshevik support quickly evaporated after 1914. By March 1917, they are little more than an isolated sect. Outside of a handful of unions and a handful of worker Bolsheviks, Lenin was hard-pressed to find worker support for his party," end quote. In 1924, Myasnikov wrote a letter from Tomsk prison, which is printed in Letters from Russian Prison, edited by Alexander Berkman. A reissuing of this book by Hyperion Press of Westport, Connecticut, in 1970 is very welcome, particularly since, for the first time, Berkman gets the credit he deserves. The Myasnikov letter appears on pages 84 to 5. The entire history of the workers' opposition is a related interest. For the best discussion of this and earlier opposition to the Bolshevik leadership, much from party members. See Robert V. Daniels' The Conscience of the Revolution. There's a couple chapters of that on this channel. For any who would doubt that this was truly Lenin's policy, I would refer to Maurice Brinton's The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, which is on this channel in full, and to my summary in my introduction in Berkman's The Russian Tragedy. It's not really a matter of debate. It simply is necessary to read Lenin's writings themselves. He is the one who refers to the Taylor system at all. The most forthright statements of Lenin in this regard are his pamphlet, The Immediate Task of the Soviet Government, which rather than being hidden away somewhere is available in almost any anthology of Lenin's works. Statements of this sort are not simply some temporary errant path which Lenin followed, but central to his program. And this is, if you read that, I've mentioned this, but one of the most prominent scholars of the Soviet Union is, or the Russian Revolution, and kind of like an important figure in just like the historiography of, or in contemporary historical writings on the history of the communist, international communism. He functionally says the same thing. He says that although he does less of a cynical approach, he thinks that like Lenin and the Bolsheviks had a kind of like flash of utopianism in like 1917, which would have been like explained the like more libertarian aspects of state and revolution. But he fundamentally argues that what the Bolsheviks more or less viewed their goals for Russia was to develop it economically. And if that meant intensification of the labor process, Taylorism, so on and so forth, then so be it. That was their primary goal. It's hard to account strict for intentions. I guess you'd have to compare and contrast other places. But if you think of just Lenin's kind of like, I don't know, completely like instrumental view of like the Soviets, I think you could probably say the same thing about a lot of the more democratic libertarian elements that would be represented in State and Revolution. So yeah, I think Nowlin, if that's his name, I can't remember, is right in saying the statements of this sort were not simply some temporary errant path which Lenin followed, but central to Lenin's program. Berkman's disillusionment is portrayed well in The Russian Tragedy, but even more forcefully in his major work on revolutionary Russia, The Bolshevik Myth. Average, The Russian Anarchist, page 188 to 189. Other anarchists denounced the bombing, as indicated in Sam Dolgoff's introduction to this edition. Consult many of the books referred to above, in particular Nowlin and Brinton. Thank you so much for listening.